So in this video we're talking about the smart construction that Swift have been producing since 2014. So it kind of came about on the back of the Bailey Alley Tech, which was being produced around about 2010, and I think Swift are kind of trying to chase that more modern way of making a caravan. The Alley Tech have been advertised as the next generation in caravan manufacturing, and Swift needed something to kind of combat that. Also, the fact that they've been making the caravans the same way for ages, with a wooden construction and an aluminium kind of frame around it, and it just needed modernising. It wasn't a new way of doing things, so they came up with a smart construction. And the problem with the old wood construction was it was letting in water. Whatever they did, they seemed to not be able to keep the water out. So this was kind of a combat towards stopping the water ingress and getting the holy grail of caravan manufacturing, where there was no water ingress. So in 2014, they brought out the smart construction, and smart stands for S is strong, M is modern, R is resilient, T, oh hang on, S is strong, M is modern, A is aerodynamic, R is resilient, and T is tested. Sorry, I'm reading that, I can never remember it. So that was what they came up with. And the first thing that they did was they swapped the wood out to a much better man-made material, which was polyurethane, which is this here. So the problem with the wooden construction was when you screwed a screw into the wood and the sealant failed on the outside, which due to age and weathering it was tending to do, then the screw would allow water into the wood, and then wood, by its very nature, moves water. That's what it does. So it started to move the water into the caravan, and that's where you got one type of water ingress. Is it would go through the screws or through a crack and then into the wood, and then the wood would then move it into the caravan, and you get water ingress where it rot the panels. Now the good thing about the polyurethane, which is this stuff here, which is rather smart, is that it is impervious to water. What that means is that if you screw into it, if the bond on the outside does fail and the screw allows water in, all it does is go into the polyurethane and comes back out again. It can't get through into the caravan. So that was a massive leap forward. The other leap forward was that this material could be, because it was man-made, it could be formed for different reasons. So around the window, it was not so dense because it needed to be lighter, and all you needed to do was kind of support the window rubber. And then in areas where it needed to be stronger and denser, of course, they could just make it stronger and denser, and they could shape it and do what they wanted. And it was a more consistent material. The wood isn't consistent. You get one batch of wood and it's got a different moisture content than another batch of wood, and it's hard to get the parameters down to the amount that they needed to be able to stop water ingress. In the old days, they just cut a big hole in it and stick some window rubber around it, but you needed it to be mill perfect. Every single caravan could be then milled out to within millimeters of a tolerance, which was what this allowed them to do. Whereas wood, you just couldn't do that because there'd be a knot in the wrong place or something like that. So the first smart construction had the polyurethane, but that was kind of all it did. It still had the plywood inside, so it was GRP on the outside, plywood inside, and then you had the polyurethane around the main construction. Then I think 2015 they stayed like that. 16 they then went to what's called a Far Eastern wallboard, which is essentially a hardwood, which actually gave us more problems than it solved, because if you did get an issue, it was really difficult to get off, whereas the old stuff, it wasn't so difficult. So that wasn't a great year. That was a bit tricky. Whenever we need to replace a wallboard in there, it's quite hard to do. Then in 2017 they went to a full GRP bonding wallboard. Now, what this gave them was a balanced panel. Now, the difference between a balanced panel and non-balanced panel is the old panels were aluminium outside and they had wood inside. So the aluminium would expand and contract at a different rate to the wood. So even if the caravan was sat still, you still had the whole caravan moving, and that would put stress on the sealant. So the sealant was always up against it. It's always going to be a difficult thing to do to stop water getting through sealant because of the weathering, because of this non-balanced panel. So the theory was, and it is a good theory, I think it's one of the best things they've done, is they produced a balanced panel. So you've got GRP on the outside, GRP on the inside. So because they're the same materials, whatever the weather does, it doesn't move. It stays the same, which again is why the sealant has less stress on it because it's not moving. So that was it. GRP on the outside, on the inside, balanced panel, polyurethane everywhere, everything's impervious to water, end of problem. Unfortunately not. There was still water ingress getting into the van. Now the problem then was the old way that the water ingress used to damage the van was it would come in and it would rot the wood around the windows and it would get in the panels, and then we had to replace the wood and then the wallboard. What was happening now was when water was getting through, which I'll go to the reasons for that in a second, it was then running down the outside of the walls and damaging the furniture board, which actually turned out to be a bigger problem than when it was damaging the wallboard, because the wallboard, we were fairly good at just swapping that out, not a problem. Now all of a sudden we're looking at replacing furniture, which was put together in the factory before the sides and the front were put on. So when you try and take furniture out of a caravan that's been already built, there's screws going into it in places you can't get to. So that created probably even a bigger problem than what we had previous. So the way that the water gets into the caravan is through the sunroof. Now I have done a whole video on sunroofs, which is below, so you can have a little look at that. But what was happening was the sunroofs were cracking, or the sealant was going around the sunroofs and then getting the top shelf and the bottom shelf damaged, and then we have to take those shelves out, which looks a bit like this once it's been done. And then we had to replace it. So it's actually turned out to be a bigger job than just replacing the wall boards. So another way that the water gets in is through what we call the cant rails. Now there's this rail that sits on the top of the caravan and it goes over onto the roof and down the side, and then it's sealed on. So it's a kind of an L-shaped panel, and that's sealed onto the top and the sides of the caravan. Now the problem with that is if the sealant fails, or in some cases wasn't applied correctly at the factory, then the water gets underneath and then goes down into the caravan. Now the reason it gets into the caravan is because the roof kind of comes along and then the sidewall goes up against it like that, and then it's screwed in here. Now there's supposed to be a bonding agent along there, and then that shouldn't allow any water through. What happens when the cant rail fails is the water gets through, there doesn't seem to be any bonding there, it goes straight down through the walls and then gets the cupboards wet inside. Now I don't make caravans, but you would have thought that if you put the roof over the side so that it sits on top of it and then screwed down through, any water that got in would then run down the outside of the wall, rather than it being like that, where there's a gap where the water can get down through. So when we take the cant rail off, you can put a spatula down through and there's a gap there. So obviously, as soon as that sealant goes, it gets down into the caravan and runs down the outside of the wall. But like I said, I don't make caravans. There's got to be a reason why they don't do that. It doesn't make any sense. Now, one point about sealant. I don't think that sealant should be the first port of call. So it shouldn't be the first line of defence. It should be a secondary line of defence, and the caravan should be engineered not to have the water come into it some other way. If you use sealant, it's been proven over and over again, doesn't matter how good the manufacturer say the sealant is, it tends to fail. And the new sealants now, the Bond and Seals, I mean, they are fantastic, but they just can't seem to keep the water out. So I'd have thought engineering it over like that, where the sealant is a kind of a secondary defence, would be the way to go. But like I said, I don't know about making caravans. There must be a reason why they don't do that. Then the third reason that water gets in is window rubbers. You can have the best construction in the world, but as soon as you put a window rubber on a caravan, it's going to fail at some stage, especially on the front, where they're on a bit of a slope and the water comes down and over, and it's a kind of a constant bombardment. We've had sealant that actually fails itself, so we couldn't understand where the water was getting through, because it looked like it had sealed on the outside of the caravan, and it looked like it sealed to the rubber. Turns out that the water was going through the sealant and it kind of goes all gooey. So that was a problem. Every time we change window rubber, we think, oh, this is it, that, you know, the problem's been solved, but then we start to get the issue again. So anywhere there's window rubber, it doesn't matter what manufacturer it is, I think it's bound to fail. So that's something that maybe they can't do anything about, I don't know, but we have to keep a constant eye on the window rubber, and we have to change it fairly regularly. That's why I got, you know, tons of it out there in my stock room. Now these things have been happening for a while, and I'm not sure if they've been solved. We're still seeing sunroofs cracking. We did one last week in the 2022, so that's still a problem. We haven't seen The cant rails for a few years. I think the last one we did was a 2020. So hopefully that's been solved. It's either that or the time, there hasn't been enough time to pass for whatever it is to break down. So whether we see them in the future, I don't know. Hopefully it's solved and we're never going to see them again. It was just kind of a little bit of a blip between kind of 2016, 17 up to kind of 2020. We do have another issue with the Swifts. It sounds like I'm having a right go at them, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But we have what's called a front end loose. So there's where the front of the Caravan, the floor actually drops, because the sidewall goes onto the wall like that, onto the side, and then the floor goes into it, and then it's screwed like that. The screws tend to be breaking. They look like, well, this is one we took out last week, and they look like this. So you can see the staining on one of them, and one of them is cracked. So technically there should be some bonding material between where the floor meets the wall to help those screws. It seems to be that the screws aren't strong enough to be able to take the stresses of that whole wall trying to push down on the Caravan as it's bouncing around, 60 mile an hour on the roads, and those screws snap. And then what happens is the floor then drops and it looks a bit like this. And as you can see, the floor is physically dropped. So what we have to do with that is take the screws out, prop the floor up, and then you can see here the way that the wall moves around out when we've taken the screws out. There's just no sealant or bonding agent there. Then we fill that with Bonder and then put some new screws in and kind of double up the screws. And then that puts it all back together again. And that's not such a big problem from us. In fact, the Caravan that I just showed you there, I bought that a few weeks ago and I didn't even notice it. Now, one of the main reasons, one of the main signs of this happening is this, where you can see that the nut for the corner steady is kind of dropped down past halfway on that hole on the side panel there, and I didn't even see it. So I'm going to have to kind of readdress how I look at these Caravans and make sure I catch these things. From our point of view, it's only a couple of hours work, not much material, so that's not too bad doing that job. But from your point of view, if you miss that and you buy a Caravan like it, you are looking at a bigger job. And this one was a relatively straightforward one. It can go all the way along. We did one last week, which actually I bought as well, that I'd missed, where the rear had gone. But again, it's relatively straightforward for us to fix that. Another sign of this that you will be able to see as a customer is if you have a look inside the gas locker, there's an aluminium trim in the corner, and you can see some of the screws have snapped where the wall's trying to kind of come down. So if you have a look in there and just have a look at those aluminium rails and there's screws missing or on the floor or they're starting to come out, that's another sign of this front end loose problem. But we haven't seen that relatively new in new Caravans. That was something that happened, and it happened to a lot of the Caravans. I think they seem to have fixed that now, but again, might be just the timescales that haven't passed to allow it to happen. Hopefully that's not the problem. So that's the front end loose issue. That's not so bad. Now, the bigger issue I have with everything else is that at the moment, everything's under warranty, which is fine because we put a claim in and Swift pay us 20 hours to do it, and we get all the materials. The problem is going to be when it's out of warranty. So as the Caravans start to get older, if it hasn't been fixed, or sometimes even if it has been fixed and the problem is inherent in the design and it happens again, then unfortunately it's going to be at the cost of the owner. Now, I've just priced up what it should cost, and we're thinking around for the sunroof and the top shelf and the bottom shelf around about £2,000 to £2,500 to do that for the materials and the labour. Now, we do replace the shelves when there's a little bit of damage, and to be completely honest, it's very hard to see. So if it was out of a non-warranty situation, you might think, well, actually, I'm not too worried about that. I'll just change the roof light, and because you can hardly see it. But obviously, when it's warranty and the customer wants everything as it is, then we have to replace it. So that might not be such an issue. You could just replace the sunroof and not worry about the tiny bit of damage that it's got. If it's been left all winter, if so it's in storage and it started 5 minutes when you put it away and you haven't seen it for 3 or 4 months, then you can get to a different problem where it is very significant. You're going to have to change it then. So the same with the cant rails. If it does damage all those cupboards and the kitchen, then those cupboards are expensive. So I think we're looking at another couple of £1,000 to do that with the labour and everything. Because again, like I said, it's not designed to come out. It's really difficult to get all this stuff out. It's not a kind of a plug and play thing where some of the screws have been put in from the outside and then the sides put in. You just can't get to them. So it's quite difficult to move this stuff in and out. It's not straightforward. So it sounds like I'm Swift bashing here and saying don't buy a Swift, but that's not the case. There's thousands of caravans out there that this may well not happen to. And obviously we see all the ones that we do have an issue with. So I would say what I'm trying to do here is stop you buying a problem that's out of warranty that you've then got to sort yourself. So because you've bought this course, this is, what I'm trying to do here is help you out. Have a look at these issues. So have a look around the cupboards and make sure there's no, you can actually feel it and you can see when it's had water ingress, it kind of goes bubbly, a bit like this. It's hard to see in this photo, but you can kind of just about see it. And with the front end loose as well, you can see where the nut for the corner steadies dropped slightly, and you can have a look inside, and if it's got that aluminium rail, not all of them do, some of them have a bit of a plastic rail, but you can see where the sealant's been stressed. So if the sealant's kind of cracked and it's all moving, you can kind of see the same issue there as when the screws come out. So I'm not saying don't buy a Swift, but I'm saying have a look at these things if you're going to have a look at one, because I'm a professional, well, supposedly, and I missed that front end loose the other day. So I'm going to have to kind of re-evaluate how I look at these Swifts going into the future. Again, it's not, it weren't too bad for us because we can fix it in a couple of hours, but it's still a cost that I have to allow for. So again, sorry for the gloomy video. Don't think I am just Swift bashing, I'm not, but I just think that we're seeing these things in the workshop and it's kind of over and over again. It's not a one-off. I'd like to think that it was a one-off and then it was all sorted and then we moved on. But it's frustrating because the smart construction with the balanced panels and the polyurethane and GRP is absolutely fantastic. It just needs a next step over that line to get to this holy grail of having a van that doesn't leak. And the guys at Swift are very clever. There must be reasons why they're not doing these things, or you solve one problem and then push the problem onto somewhere else. That might be the case. It's kind of a case of just working out which is what you can actually get away with and what you can't. So just keep an eye out for those things if you are thinking about buying a Swift product. And hopefully you won't get caught by any of those, but it'd be good if you do see something, then you can obviously stay away from it.